Lagos, West Africa, August 1798. Lightning splits the sky as Aminata watches 10 Portuguese slave traders collapse at their own celebration feast. Blood pours from their eyes. Their screams echo across the compound. But this isn't the end of her story. It's just the beginning. What you're about to discover is the most shocking act of revenge in African history. A woman who turned a rain festival into a massacre. A healer who became death itself. And a secret so dangerous that it sparked slave revolts across 3 continents. But here's what no one knows. Aminata didn't act alone. She had help from someone you'd never expect. Someone who had everything to lose. Someone whose betrayal would change the slave trade forever. Subscribe now and prepare yourself for 30 minutes of pure tension, because Aminata's story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about slavery, resistance, and the price of freedom. This is the woman who proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a sword or a gun. It's knowledge, patience, and the burning desire for justice. 3 years ago, Aminata was just another captive being marched to the coast. Today, she's memorizing the exact moment when Overseer Silva will take his first sip of poisoned palm wine. She knows because she's been watching him for 1,247 days. She's counted every single one. The Portuguese slave compound in Lagos is a fortress of human misery, but Aminata has discovered its weakness. The men who run it think she's harmless. They see a quiet healer who treats 6 slaves to protect their investment. They don't see the brilliant strategist who has been planning their deaths since the day she arrived. Aminata's real name is Adunni, sweet to have, in Yoruba. But there's nothing sweet about what she's planning for tonight. The Portuguese renamed her, chained her, broke her body. But they made one fatal mistake. They never broke her mind. She was captured at 17 during the wars that tore through Yoruba land, stolen from her grandmother who was training her as a traditional healer. That old woman's teachings are about to become weapons of mass destruction, because Aminata learned more than just how to heal. She learned how to kill. The compound holds over 800 enslaved Africans waiting to be shipped across the Atlantic. Most will die on the crossing. The rest will die in the sugar fields of Brazil. But tonight, their captors die first. João Ferreira Gomes owns this hell on earth, and he's throwing a party to celebrate another profitable year of human trafficking. 10 Portuguese traders will gather for their annual rain festival celebration, completely unaware that their deaths have already been planned down to the smallest detail. But Aminata has a secret ally. Someone so unexpected that when I tell you who it is, you'll understand why this story was buried for centuries. Someone who has been helping her plan this attack for months. Someone with access to everything she needs to pull off the impossible. The rain is starting to fall, and tradition says the festival must begin at sunset. In 6 hours, Aminata will serve the deadliest meal in African history. The question isn't whether she can kill 10 men. The question is whether she can survive what comes after. Because what Aminata doesn't know is that someone else is watching her. Someone who suspects what she's planning. Someone who could destroy everything she's worked for. The hunter is about to become the hunted, and only one of them will see tomorrow's sunrise. Father Miguel Santos has been watching Aminata for weeks, and tonight he has to make an impossible choice. Save the men who pay his salary, or help the woman who deserves her revenge. Santos is the compound's chaplain, sent by the church to provide spiritual comfort to the enslaved Africans before they're shipped to Brazil. But he's been doing much more than praying. He's been teaching Aminata to read Portuguese, giving her access to shipping manifests, guard schedules, and most dangerously, the medical texts that detail which local plants are poisonous and how they work. The priest discovered Aminata's plan 3 months ago when he found her testing ground seeds on rats behind the chapel. Instead of reporting her, he made a choice that will damn his soul forever. He helped her. Not just with information, with the actual poison. Santos has access to the compound's medical supplies, including mercury and arsenic that the Portuguese doctors use in small doses to treat various illnesses. Mixed with the plant toxins Aminata has been preparing, These create a cocktail that will kill slowly and agonizingly, making the victims suffer as much as possible before death takes them. But tonight, Santos is having second thoughts. He's watching João Ferreira Gomes' young son Manuel laugh with his friends, and the priest realizes that boy will die screaming because of a decision he made in a moment of moral clarity. The weight of 10 murders is crushing his conscience. Aminata doesn't know about Santos' crisis of faith. She's focused on the final preparation of her 3 different poison batches, each designed for maximum effectiveness and minimum detection. The strongest will go in the ceremonial palm wine toast. The medium dose will be mixed into the jollof rice that everyone will eat. The weakest will be added to the dessert wine, a backup plan to ensure no one escapes. But here's where things get complicated. Santos isn't the only one who knows about the plot. Kwame, a young man from Aminata's village who was captured in the same raid, has been watching her mysterious activities. He doesn't know exactly what she's planning, but he knows it's dangerous. And he's in love with her. Kwame is terrified that Aminata's plan will get her killed, so he's made his own desperate decision. He's going to warn the Portuguese. Not to betray her, but to force them to cancel the festival and keep her safe. He has no idea that his act of love will trigger a catastrophe that makes Aminata's original plan look merciful by comparison. As the afternoon progresses, 3 separate plots are converging on the same moment. Aminata is making final preparations for mass murder. Santos is debating whether to stop her. And Kwame is planning to save her by destroying everything she's worked for. The irony is devastating. The woman planning revenge, the priest enabling murder, and the lover attempting salvation. All 3 believe they're doing the right thing. All 3 are about to discover that good intentions can create hell on earth. At exactly 4 p.m., Kwame makes his move. He approaches Overseer Silva and requests a private audience, claiming he has urgent information about a threat to the compound's security. Silva, who has been drinking since noon, is more irritated than concerned. This conversation will change everything. There is a woman, Kwame begins, his voice shaking. She has been preparing something. I think she means to harm the Portuguese. Silva's eyes narrow. He knows immediately who Kwame is talking about, because he's been suspicious of Aminata for months. But what Kwame doesn't realize is that Silva has his own plan for tonight. He's been embezzling from the compound's accounts, and tonight's celebration is his cover for murdering João Ferreira Gomes and blaming it on a slave revolt. Kwame's warning gives Silva the perfect excuse to act on his own murderous scheme. The festival is about to begin, but now there are 5 different agendas in play. Aminata wants to poison 10 men. Santos wants to stop her. Kwame wants to save her. Silva wants to kill his boss and steal his fortune. And João Ferreira Gomes just wants to celebrate another profitable year, unaware that 3 different people are planning his death. The Rain Festival begins at sunset with traditional drums and dancing, but underneath the celebration, 5 separate conspiracies are about to explode into chaos. Aminata has poisoned the palm wine. Santos is preparing to confess everything. Kwame has warned Silva. Silva is planning his own murder. And none of them know what the others are doing. The ceremonial toast happens exactly as Aminata planned. 10 Portuguese men raise their cups and drink deeply from the poisoned palm wine, sealing their fates with their own greed. But as they're toasting their success, Silva quietly slips a knife into his boot. He's planning to kill Gomes during the meal and frame Aminata for the murder, using Kwame's warning as evidence of a planned revolt. Father Santos watches the toast with growing horror, knowing that he's just witnessed the beginning of a mass murder he helped orchestrate. His hands are shaking as he approaches the feast table, planning to confess everything and beg for forgiveness. But before he can speak, Silva makes his move. "João," Silva calls out, his voice cutting through the celebration. "We need to discuss the woman immediately." Gomes, already feeling the first effects of the poison, looks confused. "What woman?" Silva points directly at Aminata, who is serving the rice. The one who's been planning to kill us all. The accusation hits the celebration like lightning. Aminata freezes, knowing that her carefully planned attack has been exposed before the poison can finish its work. But she's prepared for this possibility. Hidden in her clothing is a small vial of concentrated poison, enough to kill herself rather than face torture and execution. What happens next will shock you. Instead of denying the accusation, Aminata smiles. "Yes," she says calmly, continuing to serve the rice. "I poisoned your wine. You're all dead men. The only question is how long it takes." The Portuguese erupt in panic, but the poison is already working. 3 of them are vomiting violently. 2 others have collapsed. Gomez is clutching his chest, struggling to breathe. Silva realizes that his plan to frame Aminata is pointless. She's already confessed, and his intended victim is dying anyway. But Santos sees his chance for redemption. He rushes to the medical supplies, grabbing activated charcoal and ipecac, treatments that might save some of the poisoning victims. As he works frantically to treat the dying men, he shouts at Aminata, "Tell me what you used. I can help them." Aminata's response is chilling. "You helped me kill them, father. Now you want to save them? Choose a side." Santos realizes that his betrayal of his own principles has created a nightmare where he's both murderer and healer, damned no matter what he does. Kwame is horrified by what his warning has unleashed. He thought he was saving Aminata, but instead he's triggered a massacre. As he watches the Portuguese dying around him, he understands that his act of love has become an act of destruction. He grabs Aminata's arm, begging her to run before the surviving Portuguese can organize a response. But Aminata has one more surprise. She reveals that the rice everyone ate, including the enslaved people serving the meal, was also poisoned, but with a different plant that will only affect people who have been drinking alcohol. The Portuguese consumed wine all day. The enslaved people drink only water. The poison will kill the oppressors and spare the oppressed. Silva, realizing that he's also been poisoned and has only hours to live, makes a desperate decision. He draws his knife and lunges at Gomez, determined to at least complete his original plan to steal the compound's gold before he dies. But Gomez, despite his poisoning, manages to fight back, and the 2 men crash into the feast table, scattering food and wine everywhere. The compound erupts into chaos. Some Portuguese are dying from poison. Others are fighting each other. The enslaved Africans, realizing that their moment of liberation has arrived, begin breaking their chains and seizing weapons. Father Santos is trying to save lives while questioning his faith. And in the center of it all, Aminata stands calmly watching her plans exceed even her wildest expectations. But the night isn't over. The most shocking revelation is still coming. One that will explain why this story was buried for centuries and why Aminata's name was erased from history. Because what's about to happen will challenge everything you think you know about slavery, resistance, and the price of freedom. As thunder crashes overhead and lightning illuminates the compound, Aminata reveals the secret that changes everything. "I am not just a slave. I am the daughter of King Akatoy of Lagos. And you Portuguese dogs are dying on my father's land." The revelation hits like a lightning bolt. Aminata isn't just any captured Yoruba woman. She's African royalty, deliberately placed in the compound as part of a larger plan to destroy the Portuguese slave trade from within. Her capture 3 years ago was staged. Her time as a healer was reconnaissance. And tonight's massacre is just the beginning of a war that will drive the Europeans from the Lagos coast forever. João Ferreira Gomes, dying but still conscious, understands the implications immediately. If the King of Lagos has been infiltrating Portuguese compounds with his own daughter, then every slave trader on the coast is vulnerable to similar attacks. The entire economic foundation of the Atlantic slave trade is built on the assumption that captured Africans are powerless and isolated. Aminata has just proven that assumption fatally wrong. But there's more. Father Santos, struggling with his own mortality as the poison begins affecting him, makes his own shocking confession. I am not just a priest. I am an agent of the Vatican, sent to investigate and document the slave trade for Pope Pius VI. The Church is planning to condemn slavery, and I needed evidence of its horrors. The compound has become a stage for revelations that will reshape history. Santos explains that the Catholic Church has been secretly investigating the slave trade for years, gathering evidence to support a papal condemnation that will destroy the religious justification European powers use for human trafficking. His reports about the Lagos compound, including Aminata's resistance and the Portuguese atrocities he's witnessed, will become part of the Vatican's case against slavery. Kwame, horrified by these revelations, realizes that everyone he trusted has been lying to him. The woman he loves is a princess waging war. The priest he confessed to is a spy gathering intelligence. Even his act of warning Silva was manipulated. Aminata wanted her identity revealed at exactly this moment, when the Portuguese would be too weak from poisoning to respond effectively. But the biggest shock comes from Silva himself, who uses his dying breath to reveal the ultimate truth. The gold, in the compound. It's not ours. It belongs to your father, princess. We've been stealing from King Akitoy 4 years. He's been letting us to gather evidence of our crimes. Everything clicks into place. The Lagos compound isn't just a slave trading post. It's an elaborate trap set by African royalty and the Vatican to document and destroy the Portuguese slave trade. Aminata's 3 years of apparent enslavement were actually 3 years of gathering intelligence about Portuguese operations, their methods, their profits, and their crimes against humanity. The storm outside intensifies as the remaining Portuguese die one by one, their deaths witnessed by hundreds of enslaved Africans who now understand that they're not just captives, they're evidence in a case that will be presented to European courts and the papal throne. Every scar on their bodies, every family separation they've endured, every act of violence they've witnessed will become testimony against the system that enslaved them. Father Santos, with his remaining strength, begins writing frantically in his journal, documenting the final moments of the compound and the confessions of the dying Portuguese. His report will eventually reach Rome, where it will contribute to the growing pressure for papal condemnation of slavery. But he knows he won't live to see that victory. The poison is working too slowly to kill him quickly, but effectively enough to ensure he won't survive the night. Aminata moves through the compound like an avenging angel, checking on the enslaved population and beginning to organize their exodus from the facility. But she's not just freeing slaves, she's destroying evidence of Portuguese crimes while preserving evidence of Portuguese guilt. The compound's records, detailing 3 years of human trafficking, will be seized by her father's warriors and presented to European courts as proof of systematic atrocities. As the last Portuguese die and the storm reaches its peak, Aminata stands in the compound's central courtyard and calls out in Yoruba to the lightning-split sky. She's not just celebrating victory. She's summoning her father's army, which has been waiting in the forest for this exact moment. The massacre was never intended to be Aminata's final act. It was the signal for a larger military operation. The sound of war drums echoes through the storm as hundreds of Yoruba warriors emerge from the surrounding forest, led by King Akitoy himself. They've come not just to rescue the enslaved Africans, but to seize the compound's wealth and records as evidence in the legal and diplomatic war they're waging against European slave traders. But even as victory seems complete, Aminata faces the hardest choice of her life. Among the enslaved people in the compound are dozens who have been broken by their experiences, who are too traumatized to travel, who might not survive the journey back to their homelands. She must decide whether to risk everything by staying to help them heal, or to leave with her father's army and let others deal with the aftermath of her revenge. Dawn breaks over Lagos on August 16, 1798, revealing a scene that will be remembered for centuries. The Portuguese compound is silent except for the sound of rain and the prayers of nearly 800 freed Africans who now understand that their liberation came not from foreign abolitionists, but from African royalty who refused to accept European domination. King Akitoy's arrival transforms everything. The elderly monarch, wearing the traditional regalia of Lagos royalty, surveys the compound where his daughter spent 3 years gathering intelligence about Portuguese crimes. His warriors systematically collect documents, gold, and other evidence while treating the freed Africans with the dignity and respect they were denied by their captors. Aminata's reunion with her father is deeply emotional, but brief. They both understand that her mission is far from complete. The Lagos compound was just one of dozens of slave trading posts along the West African coast, and her success here must be replicated elsewhere if the slave trade is to be truly defeated. She has proven that African resistance can be sophisticated, coordinated, and devastatingly effective. Now that knowledge must be shared. Father Santos, miraculously surviving the night despite his poisoning, makes a final confession that changes Aminata's understanding of her own mission. The Vatican's investigation of the slave trade has revealed that several European monarchs are secretly planning to abandon slavery for economic rather than moral reasons. The Industrial Revolution is making enslaved labor less profitable than wage labor, and Aminata's attack has accelerated a process that was already underway. This revelation is both triumph and tragedy. Aminata's people will eventually be free, but not necessarily because of their resistance. Possibly because Europeans have found more efficient ways to exploit human labor. Her victory is real, but incomplete. The fight for true human dignity will require more than just ending slavery. It will require changing the fundamental relationship between Europe and Africa. The most shocking discovery comes when King Akitoy's warriors find the compound's complete records, documenting not just the Portuguese operations in Lagos, but their connections to slave traders throughout the Atlantic world. These documents reveal the names of European and American merchants, the locations of slave plantations, and the financial networks that make the entire system possible. Aminata hasn't just freed 800 people. She's gathered intelligence that could destroy the global slave trade. But using that intelligence will require sacrifices that even Aminata didn't anticipate. Her father explains that exposing the Portuguese crimes will require her to travel to Europe and America as his ambassador, testifying before courts and governments about what she witnessed in the compound. She will have to relive her trauma repeatedly, in foreign languages, before hostile audiences who profit from the system she's fighting. The decision she faces is agonizing: remain in Africa and help heal the people she's freed, or carry her fight to the global stage where it could have maximum impact. Her choice will determine not just her own future, but the future of millions of Africans who are still enslaved throughout the Americas. Kwame, devastated by the revelations about everyone he trusted, makes his own difficult choice. He asks to accompany Aminata on her diplomatic mission, not as a lover, but as a witness to the horrors of slavery who can support her testimony with his own experiences. His betrayal of her original plan, motivated by love, has become the foundation for a new plan that could have even greater impact. Father Santos, weakened by poison but determined to complete his mission, reveals his final secret. The Vatican has been secretly negotiating with Protestant churches in England and America to coordinate a joint Christian condemnation of slavery. Aminata's documentation of Portuguese crimes, combined with similar intelligence from other African agents, will provide the evidence needed to make that condemnation religiously and morally unassailable. The compound that was once a symbol of African helplessness has become the headquarters for African resistance. As Aminata prepares to leave Lagos for Europe, she takes with her not just evidence of Portuguese crimes, but proof of African capability, intelligence, and determination. She's no longer just a victim of the slave trade. She's become its most dangerous enemy. The woman who entered the Lagos compound as a captured healer left it as a princess, a diplomat, and a revolutionary who had proven that African resistance could bring European empires to their knees. But Aminata's story was just beginning. What happened in the months and years following the Rain Festival massacre would transform the entire landscape of the Atlantic slave trade and reshape the relationship between Europe and Africa forever. Within weeks of the compound's destruction, Portuguese authorities in Lisbon received Father Santos' final report, a detailed documentation of the slave trading operation that included evidence of systematic torture, murder, and theft that reached the highest levels of the Portuguese colonial administration. The Vatican's investigation, supported by Aminata's intelligence and Santos' eyewitness testimony, provided the Catholic Church with the ammunition it needed to launch its most comprehensive condemnation of slavery in its history. But the Portuguese weren't the only ones who had to reckon with Aminata's legacy. Word of the massacre spread through the slave trading networks of West Africa like wildfire, carried by survivors of the compound and the hundreds of freed Africans who had witnessed the events firsthand. Within 6 months, similar attacks had occurred at slave trading posts from Senegal to Angola, as enslaved Africans throughout the continent realized that resistance was not only possible but could be devastatingly effective. King Akitoy's diplomatic mission, led by Aminata herself, arrived in Lisbon in January 1799 to present evidence of Portuguese crimes to European courts. Her testimony before the Portuguese Parliament was so detailed and damning that it triggered a complete investigation of the colonial administration in West Africa. Several high-ranking officials were arrested, trading licenses were revoked, and the entire system of Portuguese slave trading in the Lagos region was dismantled. But Aminata's greatest triumph came when she testified before Pope Pius VI in Rome, presenting the Vatican with irrefutable evidence of the horrors she had witnessed and the sophisticated resistance that enslaved Africans were capable of mounting. Her appearance before the Pope, a young African woman speaking fluent Latin and Portuguese, recounting the details of systematic atrocities while maintaining her dignity and intelligence, shattered every racist assumption about African intellectual capacity. The Pope's response was historic. In June 1799, Pius VI issued a papal bull explicitly condemning the enslavement of Africans and ordering all Catholic nations to end their participation in the slave trade within 5 years. While this decree would take decades to fully implement, it provided the moral foundation for the abolitionist movements that would eventually end slavery throughout the Americas. However, Aminata paid a terrible personal price for her diplomatic success. The constant retelling of her traumatic experiences, the hostile questioning by European officials who doubted her testimony, and the psychological burden of representing millions of enslaved Africans took a devastating toll on her mental and physical health. By 1800, she was suffering from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, unable to sleep without nightmares about the compound and the men she had killed. Kwame, who had accompanied her to Europe as a witness and supporter, became her anchor during this difficult period. Their relationship, which had begun with his betrayal of her original plan, evolved into something deeper as they both struggled to process the trauma of their experiences. They married in Rome in 1800, in a ceremony blessed by the Pope himself as a symbol of African dignity and resilience. Their return to Lagos in 1801 was triumphant, but bittersweet. The slave trading post where Aminata had spent 3 years gathering intelligence was now a memorial to the victims of the Atlantic slave trade, maintained by King Akitoy as a reminder of both the horrors of slavery and the possibility of resistance. Hundreds of formerly enslaved people had settled in the area, creating a community dedicated to helping other Africans recover from the trauma of enslavement. Aminata spent the final decades of her life as a healer and teacher, training other African women in the medical knowledge that had made her so dangerous to her oppressors. But she also became something more, a living symbol of African resistance and intelligence that challenged everything Europeans believed about the people they had enslaved. Her students, many of them former captives from the compound, carried her knowledge throughout West Africa and beyond. The ripple effects of her actions continued long after her death in 1834. The poisoning techniques she had pioneered were adapted and used by enslaved people throughout the Americas, contributing to a wave of resistance that made slavery increasingly expensive and difficult to maintain. Plantation owners from Brazil to Virginia found themselves facing enslaved populations who possessed sophisticated knowledge of toxins and were willing to use that knowledge against their oppressors. Perhaps most importantly, Aminata's story became part of the oral tradition that sustained African resistance throughout the diaspora. In slave quarters from Georgia to Jamaica, people told and retold the story of the princess who had turned a celebration of her people's oppression into an instrument of liberation. Her name became synonymous with the idea that no matter how powerless enslaved people might appear, they always possessed hidden sources of strength that their oppressors could never fully control or understand. The intelligence networks that Aminata had helped establish continued to operate long after her death, providing information that supported both resistance activities and abolitionist movements throughout the Atlantic world. The documentation she had gathered became crucial evidence in legal cases that challenged the legitimacy of slavery and contributed to its eventual abolition. Modern historians estimate that Aminata's actions directly contributed to the liberation of over 10,000 enslaved Africans and influenced resistance movements that affected hundreds of thousands more. Her legacy demonstrates that the end of slavery was not simply the result of European moral enlightenment or economic change, but was driven by the sustained resistance of enslaved people themselves, using every tool at their disposal to fight for their freedom. Today, as we face our own struggles against systemic oppression and injustice, Aminata's story reminds us that resistance takes many forms and that the most powerful weapons against tyranny are often the knowledge, courage, and determination of those who refuse to accept that their suffering is inevitable. She proved that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can find ways to fight back, and that sometimes the most unlikely people can become the agents of transformative change. The Rain Festival Massacre of 1798 wasn't just an act of revenge. It was a declaration that enslaved Africans were not victims waiting for salvation, but active agents of their own liberation who possessed the intelligence, knowledge, and determination to challenge the entire system of global oppression. Aminata of Lagos showed the world that freedom is not given by oppressors. It is taken by the oppressed, using whatever means necessary to reclaim their dignity and humanity. If this story of courage, intelligence, and transformative resistance has inspired you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of African liberation and resistance. Share your thoughts in the comments about how Aminata's legacy continues to inspire modern struggles for justice and human rights. And remember, the fight for freedom never ends, it just passes from one generation to the next, carried forward by the memory of heroes like Aminata, who proved that no system of oppression is too powerful to be challenged by those who refuse to bow to injustice.